All right. Hello and welcome, Crystal, to the latest edition of the free lunch, when I like to have interesting conversations over a lunchtime break with people who I look on as interesting professionals, people in leadership positions doing interesting things. And indeed, Crystal, you fit that bill extremely well. Crystal Elam is currently the Senior Vice President of Growth and Operations at RVO Health, which is a joint venture backed by United Health Group. Did I get that right?
You did.
Fantastic. And has an extremely interesting career in health and in some other things as well, which I hope you'll tell us about. I have known Crystal for a few years. We knew each other in Dallas, which is where Crystal is from, and our children, our friends, and that kind of thing. And I think that she will be a great person to talk to us today a little bit about how she sees leadership and what she thinks is important. So, Crystal, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you're doing now and what you've done in the past. I'm particularly interested in, I know you've come into some kind of quite tricky new kind of startup-y type things within a big organization, and you need to bring about change and get people to rethink and redo the strategy. And I'm interested to hear about some of that stuff, but I'm sure we'll get to it.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me. I'm honored and humbled to be with you. It's exciting, and I hope I make you proud today.
You will.
Um, so yes, I am current leader at RVO Health. I think it's interesting. Not it's unique, I'd say, to have a position or a role, an opportunity to lead both growth and operations. Oftentimes, those are two very, distinct and unique and different types of positions, particularly at a leadership level. But this was an opportunity for me to do both. I have background in both, so I kind of take you on a little bit of a journey about me and
Hmm.
how I got here. My career started in really siding and roofing. So they called them the storm chasers. And, even before I went off to college, I wanted to earn a little bit of money. And one way to do that was to, you know, dial for dollars, as they say. And this was when, storms would come through and cause roof damage, hail damage to cars and roofing. We would, call and offer our services. And that was a way. And I was paid based on the number of appointments that I would qualified leads, as it were, to schedule. And it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about rejection, and we can go into that all day. But I will just say it was a good place to start. It was quick money, but it was also very difficult and challenging, and taught me a lot about myself and how to handle adversity at a very young age. From there, and after college, I
Just
really
out of interest, did you spend a lot of time looking at the Weather Channel to see where there was a storm coming in?
I did, and would get excited about it. And to this day, I can't tell if it's genetic because my dad also gets very excited about the weather. So it's either from
Okay.
that or those early days in the storm chasing that get me excited. But storms and damage meant money to me.
There we go.
But college I was the first person in my family to go to college. I was grateful to the sacrifices my dad and mother made in order to help me afford to go. I went and attended the University of Virginia Tech in
Okay.
Blacksburg, Virginia, and I focused in international business. After I graduated from college, the dot-com era had just blown up. So it was very difficult at that time to find a job, and more adversity came my way, but school loans were rolling in. And so I made the, decision to go ahead and travel and backpack overseas, staying in hostels with a best girlfriend of mine, hopping on and off trains and just having a ton of fun and just seeing where life take us because, why not? That's the age and that's where you can do that. At some point my dad said, "Hey, it's time. These loans are coming in and it's time for you to go ahead and grow up and get a job." And I started putting my feelers out there, and lo and behold, because there were so many hiring freezes at that time, I was having trouble. And I knew I was sort of afraid for the very first time in my life. Oh gosh, what if I don't get a job? How will I afford this? And what a waste, has my college career been a waste? But I had the fortunate ability to have through mentorship. I've always believed in mentorship, and we can talk a little bit about that. But through a mentor of mine, she reached out and said, "Hey, Southern California hasn't really been as impacted as much as some of the other places in the US." And at the time, I was in the Northeast, just outside of Washington, D.C. The problem was I was entry level, and nobody was going to pay for a relocation package to move me across the US. So I bought a one-way ticket and no car, no job, no promises, and slept on the couch of a friend through a friend. And
Hmm.
a few weeks later, I got a job with GE, and it was just sort of a little bit of timing and a little bit of persistence and determination, and ended up finding a home and a great job. And this was at the end of Jack Welch era, so I don't know how much. I know
Hmm.
there's been lots of books published on his unique leadership style, but I think the one thing that I took away from my experience with GE was just how important it is to invest in people,
Yeah.
not just with coaching and guidance, although that's very, very important and something that's passion of mine, but also through trainings and courses and just investing in their extended education, in graduate program. And so I was fortunate they did encourage me to go back to school, and so I worked full time and went back and got my MBA at Pepperdine in finance,
Wow.
because I realized that
Did they actually used to fire 10% of the workforce?
they sure did, and you did not want to be on that bottom 10%. Every year, there was sort of that panic of, have I done enough? Have I achieved enough? And how do I reflect that in my end of year performance review?
So that really was a thing. I mean, I've often
Very
wondered
much.
whether that was a bit of an apocryphal story and whatever, like a bit of sort of soundbitey stuff. But he really had that principle. So if you didn't
It was.
deliver and you weren't in the top 90%, then that was the end of you.
That's right. And, as you might imagine, over the years, you start cutting into talent. But
Yeah.
he really believed that the business tenet was, there's always 10% of
Mm,
folks out there that maybe are not reaching the levels we want them to, or consistently performing in the ways that we need them to. And I don't think, in retrospect, he was doing it as a fear mongering tactic. I really do think that it was a way for him to be meaningfully intentional about how he performance managed.
yeah.
And so that was what he held all of his leaders to, and it emanated. It didn't matter what type of position. You could be a janitor. If you weren't in the top 90%, you were at risk. So
But I
that
think just to say, I mean, so I don't interrupt your flow of your telling us about your life, which is super interesting. But and I love that getting on a train or whatever you got on and not a train in US, sorry. Getting on a plane and going to California, that, as you know, I'm a big believer in self-leadership, and you sometimes got to do this stuff. And GE was a pretty nice fish to land. Um, but I was thinking just for a second there about that idea of, we fire the sort of least performing 10%. If you're going to do something like that, you've got to have great systems. Because one of the things I find when I sometimes talk to executives and teams is that the teams don't feel they have clear objectives. So if someone turns around and he says, "Hey, you're in the bottom 10%," and they're like, "Well, I didn't even know what I was supposed to do." So I imagine the systems were pretty clear. If,
I'd like to say that they were perfectly clear. I do want to probably admit that there was more bias in there, that we maybe, in unconscious bias, that we, at that time I was sort of on the bottom, certainly entry level by any standards. And I think as people were evaluating not only my performance, but other people's performance, there was absolutely some unconscious bias there. I mean, process is only as good as those who follow it, but even then, you have some psychological components that add in there, that it was definitely not a perfect system by any means.
yeah.
So it was an interesting impact on me, because this was a very early phase of my career. Sort of taking education and now I'm putting it into practice. And the earliest influence was Jack Welch. And
I
sort of
think
that.
that's super interesting, and I'm sure that has had a kind of impact on you in terms of your work ethic and stuff. And it could go either way, right? You might be super against that as an idea, or you might feel there was actually some good in it. I
I
suspect
actually
there was
have
a
a
bit of
funny
both.
story. The one thing that sticks out. You want to know?
Yeah.
How to write an email, especially today, where people oftentimes, and I'm certainly guilty of that when I'm moving quickly. You speak in conversational tones. I don't know
Hmm.
if it's maybe because we're used to texting, more frequently, and that's how we communicate, is sort of in these short bites. But I got to tell you, you never sent an email that wasn't going to be seen. You should expect it to be seen by the CEO. I mean, that was sort of how they trained us. And if you didn't read and reread, and maybe a third or fourth time read your email before you sent it to anyone, not just a client or someone of importance, but just anyone, and make sure that it was grammatical, very professional, grammatically appropriate, all of those things were in place, you were in big trouble. And so I would say that was one of his sticklers. And
Yeah.
and
Well,
to this day
I
sticks
love
with
that
me.
because I actually quite strong. I mean, I think chat stuff um, now has allowed that kind of back and forth, bing bong, bing bong, bing bong. But when it comes to an email, I have to say, I recognize that I'm old, but I like to write a proper message,
Sure.
and I always say, "Thank you very much" at the end and sign it or whatever it is. And there are these people that just send you these one-liners, and you kind of think, "I sent you a proper email. You sent me a one-liner."
Yeah, I think it's how you receive it. It does. It evokes an emotion when
Right.
and sometimes when it's shorthand that way. And so, right, wrong, or indifferent, that is an embedded skill that I took with me. But
I love it.
I had a lot of opportunity there through training, formal training outside of education, but also with advanced education at Pepperdine. But really, that helped advance my selling skills, how to appropriately define a growth strategy, how to execute to that strategy, how to adjust and adapt based on market needs. Those were sort of the core fundamental lessons that I learned very early in my career. And it wasn't just because of the job I was executing to, it was because of the training and the ongoing persistence of training. And I think you've probably heard the stories about Six Sigma. No one really talks about that anymore, but
Mhm.
I'm also a Six Sigma black belt, and
Ah,
everybody, including the janitors, were also expected to have a black belt. And just those early understandings of how to think about process in a way that reduces redundancy and efficiency certainly had an impact on me. But continued to be with GE for almost 10 years, and then I met a man, Kyle, as you know, my husband now, and we've been married for almost 18 years. But he was a Texan and wanted to move back, and I made the decision after graduate school and after being with GE to look for other opportunities. I didn't want to leave GE, but at that time they had very siloed organizations, and they've talked a lot about that. I think, and you've probably read case studies and things like that. Harvard, I think, did a business review on it, but about the impact of organizations and how they structure themselves.
right.
And back then, it was very normal and common to have, matrix didn't exist back then. Matrix style organizations was all very siloed, and I was considered a top performer. And so they really didn't. I wanted to go pursue interest in GE Capital and different divisions to broaden my career and skill sets, and it was sort of frowned upon, and it wasn't supported by management. So I went ahead and made the decision to start looking, and lo and behold, I entered into the biotechnology world, so the world of genomics, and took growth leadership. So I was managing a team, and this was sort of my first entree into transformation and reimagination. So when Myriad Genetics, which was the company that I worked for, decoded the genome, they created an opportunity or a way to really create and identify high risk patients before they got cancer, and
Mm.
to help give them options for their healthcare that maybe they wouldn't have chosen or known about prior to the diagnosis of having a genetic break. And so when I was leading the sales and growth team there, insurance didn't pay for these tests. They were very expensive. This was the first time we were really using genomics in a targeted way for targeted healthcare and targeted outcomes. And so providers didn't know what to do with it. They didn't, they thought they had to be a genetic counselor. So this was the first place in a how do you drive growth when you
Mm.
have a disruptive net new product to a marketplace where
Sounds like you leapt into a sort of completely new kind of pool where not only were you dealing with a kind of transformation or business, but
right,
also you were managing people for the first time,
right,
right?
right,
So that
right.
must have, I bet that was a pretty tough period.
It was. Anytime I think you go from an individual contributor to managing people, it is certainly an evolution. And I don't, at the time, there wasn't any formal training to say, hey, you're a net new manager. Let me put you through this, how to manage people course. And I
Right.
think many organizations don't do that today. And I have, people in my downline that are new managers, and we try to put some things in place to give them the right supports. But I don't think companies do as much as they should to support, new managers. It's sort of a pick yourself up by the bootstraps and figure it out along the way, using
That's right.
some guiding
It
principles.
is. It is actually really interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, I'd love to know if you have any kind of like particular sort of little nuggets from that time for people who are starting to manage people. Um, because I think that some of the folks who listen to this are at that kind of moment in their life. Um, because what's absolutely clear for me is that as a coach, probably 85, 90% of what I do is about working with people to help them to manage people. And most of the issues that people are facing, leaders, executives, whatever, they're people issues. It's
Mhm.
about how do I have that conversation with that person? How do I get this person to change? Oh, that's a good one. Um, how do I get this person to see that they're not actually playing to their strengths? How do I fire this person because I really like them, but they're terrible at their job? All these different things. How do I get my business partner to actually turn up on time? It's really amazing. I mean, people are. I always say every individual is their own private universe.
Very
You
true.
do not expect people to kind of adhere to some kind of cookie cutter thing, because if you've got 10 people in your team, you're going to have 10 different types of cookie cutter. Do you have any particular thoughts on that just before we move on?
Yes, I think the most uncomfortable was, to your point, around when you have to get your words around how to coach when someone's not performing.
Mm,
Um, that is one of the hardest things to do as a new manager, particularly if you have to move them into a coaching plan or performance improvement plan, and then ultimately have to terminate based on, you know, their performance. And I would say what I did now. Hopefully, this will be helpful to someone else, but is I used mentors
mhm,
to help me who had already been through it, who could actually. I practiced with them. I role played with them. That came a little bit from a, sales tactic. So whenever
mm,
you're learning to sell, they teach you what the value prop is, and back when I was first learning, oftentimes you videotaped yourself, so you could get all the awkwardness out of it. But the intent was to get your words so that you could be authentic, so that you could
yeah.
show up in the best version of yourself, put things in context for yourself so that you could be confident in what you were saying. So much of it is just having the confidence. We,
Mhm,
I think, unintentionally create our own self doubt, particularly when there's a new skill set we're learning or practicing. So mentors were my ticket to really help me get over the hump on being comfortable. And I think to some degree, right, as human beings, we should maybe always be a little uncomfortable when we're firing
mm,
people.
mhm,
I think that's healthy. But where it gets tricky, or where it becomes, a terrible experience for the person you're trying to terminate, is if you are awkward in your delivery. And so I think finding someone that you trust, that you feel safe with, that can give you tips and tricks on how they have framed it or had hard conversations, and then journaling or finding a way to write that down in your own words, and then practice it before you're in front of that other person, because to me that was the hairiest conversation to have, or the hardest part to manage through.
yeah,
second to that
yeah, Karen.
Second to that, I'll just finish the would be, especially as sort of middle manager,
Mm,
you have to be able to interpret the vision of, and to be almost like the, yeah, just yeah, that word, interpreter. And so if you don't clearly understand the long-term vision, the North Star, and cannot turn to your people and clearly articulate what it is we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to get there, it's really hard to get people to realize their potential and to get them motivated, right, and focused on the right things. So I'd say that's the other piece that no one teaches you. There's no real rule book. I think you just kind of have to find your words. And if you have questions and you don't quite understand it yourself, make sure you ask. And
right.
I think leaders will appreciate you for it. And there may be some fear in that, in asking, but don't be afraid to ask for, hey, let's talk a little bit about the vision. I want to, be a little more immersed in that. Particularly because you have to then turn around and get your team to latch on to that. So that would be the second thing.
I think that's super interesting. I mean, in those periods, the thing that's so complicated is that you're being watched, right? Everyone's watching you. They know that this person is going to go eventually. Everyone knows
Right.
this, and you're the one who's got to make it happen. So you're kind of under this test to see how you're going to handle it, right?
Right.
And
Right.
that can be really, really difficult. And I love the way you tied it. The idea of tying it to the bigger vision. I have this thing I call the API of leadership. It's mentioned in the book, which is A is for awareness,
Hmm.
which we talked about before, that self-awareness or awareness of the situation, awareness of the impact that this person who you need to terminate is having on everybody else.
Hmm.
Just
Hmm.
to be very selfish, what's this person not doing or doing for me or for the organization, but actually what are they like as a colleague? Um, and then the P is for purpose. So that's, to your point, that's the North Star that you've really got to have. And then the I is for inspiration.
That's it.
Go and inspire people. And it's very interesting. One question: how did you find those mentors?
Great question. Also, something that can be uncomfortable to do.
Right.
The first place I looked were women who I had known from my business classes and had kept in touch with from college and graduate school. And
Hmm.
I say women only because I was hungry for us to have some sort of shared experience as females in leadership. And so I started there. Who were women that I had classes with or had known that I had kept in touch with? And then I started creating. I asked them, formally, like I created let's have a coffee, a virtual coffee. Let's meet. Let's talk on the phone. And then I would just formally ask them, hey, would you be willing to be my mentor?
Right.
That asking was the most important part because sometimes you can meet with people or leverage your network and you can get bits and pieces of advice, but it's the ongoing, very intentional, you know, putting someone in place as your true mentor and them knowing that they're your mentor that I believe has been the most valuable for me to grow and learn and certainly in a safe way,
Yeah. And
comfortable.
and I know that you'll have seen this in the book, and I don't want to keep going on about my book, but it's funny because I talk about this idea of people's egos, right?
Hmm.
That
Yeah.
there's nothing in ego seems to have this kind of negative connotation, but if you approach somebody and you say, I've observed you, I think you could really help me. Would you be ready to give up a few minutes of your week to listen to some of my issues and give me some thoughts? It's a very strange person that turns around and says, "No, no, Crystal, sorry, that's not going to happen." And so much of it is how you approach them, right? And
Sure.
if you make it about them a bit, in
That's
other
right.
words,
Feed
I
into that a bit.
would love some of your whatever you have, as opposed to it's all about me. I need this from you. I think that was super wise. I think that was very wise to go and find mentors.
Yeah, thank you for that. It has been very fruitful, and I like that you're talking about it on your podcast because I love a good framework, and people don't know how they. I love the concept of mentorship, but don't really know how to approach it, and they don't really know how to do it, and haven't maybe been as successful getting much out of it because they don't know how to approach it. And I think you're right. I think it's playing into that ego a bit that it can be particularly useful and listen, everybody who has an ego, I think sometimes it's rooted in they have special knowledge that might be good for us. If we use our own humility to at least start with curiosity about why they have an ego,
Yeah.
oftentimes it can pay off in spades to really just seek to understand, that part of them.
And so just you said about a framework there. That just I think the message you're saying, I just want to make sure I've got it right, is if you are in a certain stage of your career, you have challenges, then identify the people that you look up to, and rather than just looking up to them from afar, actually do something about it. Approach them, talk to them, see if they're ready to share some wisdom with you, or whatever. Is that kind of what you would suggest?
Absolutely. And you have to be, you have to be the one that takes the lead. You are completely empowered and don't be afraid to do it. To your point, most people are, I haven't had a single person say, no, I don't want to invest in time, spending time with you on a regular basis, or no, I'm unwilling or can't or won't be your mentor. Most are honored and grateful to be able to pay it forward. But it's not something that people go around and say, "Hey, I'm available for mentorship." They don't advertise their services. So knowing that you really have to be empowered and find a little confidence to be willing to reach out to people. But it'll pay off if you just do so.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. Of course, there are companies that kind of give you a mentor and that sort of stuff,
Sure.
but to actually choose the people that you want and approach them,
Right.
I I think that's brilliant. Okay, sorry I interrupt you, but
No, so I
only
was
interrupt you 'cause it's really interesting.
I love it. I'm excited too. I love the tangents we go off on. The Myriad Genetics was great in that learned a lot about leading teams, and that was sort of my first you know entry into people managing and what that means, and how did I want to leave my mark as a manager, and what did I still have to learn. But eventually it got to a point with sales where, and even sales leadership, where I loved it, but I found myself gravitating and go on this journey with me towards a concept that I call the pull through versus sell to. Have you heard
Mm,
about this before?
no, I would like to hear all about it.
So most of the time you should, you have, sales, you can have a great value story, right? Just something super interesting. And there's a perfect product for, problem out there that your product or your service solves. And it's so much fun to deliver that. But if you only just do that piece, you only sell something to someone or a company or organization, you're missing out on the bottom of the iceberg, which is how then is that organization going to sell through, right? Drive engagement, utilization of whatever it is you just sold to them.
Hmm.
That became more of my focus because I realized whether it's retaining a client or growing into net new or even getting referrals, oftentimes, is that I cared more about their business and how specifically my product, but really any of their products and services that were making them good money. I invested time to consult with them on how to pull that through. And that's why I call it the pull through. It's not just pull my products and services through, but to pull even ancillary or complementary products and services through, sort of leaving my ego at the door around what my agenda was to just sell them, business and grow the business, although that's important and we can't forget about it. But I was so much more successful when I started learning that if I care about and put some thought and energy into pulling through that cell, that I would be wildly, that much more successful. Maybe be willing to buy even more. And
So
so
it was
that's
like
what I
sort of
did.
widening the aperture, right? I mean, instead of focusing on the sale and saying thanks very much, it was about how what you were selling them would change their situation, and then you would continue the conversation almost.
That's right. And so eventually a friend of a friend called me and said she was working at United at the time. And she said, "Hey, what are you doing these days?" And I said, she was a mentor of mine. And I said, "Well, I'm working for Myriad Genetics and I'm a growth leader here in the DFW area and I love it." She says, "But what are you actually doing?" And so I explained sort of this, well, I'm pulling through, sales and spending less time actually, traditionally pitching and doing more of what I'd call this pull through. And she says, I think you need to come and work for the readiness team. And I said, "What is readiness?" And I don't know how much you know, or if your audience would care too much about readiness, but readiness was another pivotal moment in my career. So I took the leap and I went in and I left growth and I started into what I'll call more of a business operations roles
Hmm.
with United and into healthcare, traditional healthcare, digital healthcare, and readiness is really if I could try to describe it, it's what I'd call sort of an internal consulting function designed to say, hey, if the organization is launching something net new or going through a big transformation, how do we understand the impacts of what this is going to do to our existing business? And
Okay.
are we really mature enough to handle it? And so it's making sure that you're not only ready, because ready to means ready to launch the
Mm.
product, but that we can withstand scale, that we can cost effectively scale right out of the gate. It's sort of appreciating that there's going to be a quick phase two even after we get into the market and making sure we're paying attention to that as our overall plan to be ready, not just getting ready for that initial launch.
Right.
And boy, do you really get to understand the business end to end when you have to really consider what does every team have to do in order to be ready, and are they really mature today, and what happens if we throw a whole bunch of transformation at them
Hmm.
to be mature and ready tomorrow. And I think that was where I really understood that companies can change can happen without panic and fear. Transformation means something a little different to everybody, also important. And to mobilize teams and be successful, like really successful in transformation, particularly if you're using, new investment dollars in a capital raise or something like that, you have to be really focused and prudent on understanding what are the impacts and how do we work together. You can't just be focused on what I have to do and then throw it over the fence. You really do have to come together and create a collaborative network of sharing of impacts and working through it from a solutions based mindset.
That is extremely interesting, and I would have thought that incredibly relevant. So many kind of quite small companies, particularly in the healthcare sector, it seems to me in the US, that's my impression of sort of brilliant ideas, but
Hmm.
they've got to scale, right?
Hmm.
They're maybe they're profitable businesses already, but they're small. Maybe they're small and not very profitable, but the potential's enormous. So this kind of concept of readiness is really about saying, how do we scale this? And it's not just about growing the volume, right?
That's
It's
right. It's scaling in a smart way and being ready to do it quicker, sooner than later. Because especially if you are confident in the concept or the idea that you have, and you know that it's going to win. It's not just about having your organizational structure, although that's very important. I don't want to minimize that in place. It's about how do you mobilize the teams in order to execute to that change in a systematic way so that we're thinking ahead and planning for that versus just the here and the now. And although that sounds very simple and easy, it goes back to a framework around it is not natural for people to be worried about everybody else's team and what everybody else has to do. They're really right only focused, and a lot of that is time. We're squeezed for time, and so they can only be focused on what they need to do. But I tell you, the most successful transformations have been when we've been planful about anticipating quick scale, when we were definitely in instances where we were confident we had the right idea. We just needed to make sure that not only were we organized from a team structure, but also could we execute together and plan for scale.
Yeah, I certainly agree that people often don't have time to find out more about and understand more about what others are doing. But it's very, very useful when they do make the time. And it's
Absolutely.
extraordinary to see when you get two teams together that they kind of basically ignored each other and they're like, oh, wow, you do that. That's interesting. Um, so if you've worked in this kind of very transformational kind of environment where really it sounds like everything was about change and growth, is there any one or two kind of particular things that you felt, if you want to make this stuff work, you got to have this or you got to have that. Is there any particular thing that you have mentioned?
I would say the willingness to be vulnerable and transparent. And I say that because I think because everybody and many companies unintentionally or maybe intentionally, in Jack Welch's instance it was intentional, have sort of fear around performance. If you don't performance, these things will happen, or if you do perform, these great things will happen. And so I think the unintentional sort of outcome of that is that we build in fear, right, to change, build in fear to do things, to break things, and think transformatively. But if you're willing to be vulnerable and be able to show up and say, I'm going to be creative, I'm going to be open minded to work with everyone. But when something is not working, I'm going to raise my hand and say that it's not working sooner rather than later. And
Right.
so the vulnerability to be transparent and then work with your team to solve for it, there hasn't been a pickle yet that I haven't been able to get out of
Right.
because
Right.
of the willingness to be vulnerable. And I think it's contagious is the other part, is that if as leaders, and so kind of transitioning from management into leadership taught me that if I model and demonstrate that behavior, people will come on board because they see someone else doing it and not getting in trouble.
Sure.
It sort of washes away some of those built-in, fears or issues with self-confidence. But then, they start to feel that we actually move faster when we're
Hmm.
willing to call a spade and say, hey, you know, I'm not going to ignore reality. I'm going to lean into it and say, this is not working. Here's the impact and why, and we need to regroup.
Yeah.
And so I'd say that's the number one thing. I think people just sort of get on this path and they're headed down and they don't pause to really reflect and say, "Ooh, are we being honest about whether or not this is working?"
And do you find that you have to create kind of special structures to make a transformation work? So when you've got an established setup, you've got sales team, marketing team, operations team, they're all working away, they've got their objectives, they know who their boss is, and hopefully there's not too much politics, but there's always a bit of politics. Hopefully they're not too siloed, but there's always a bit of that. And because one of the things that I've found over the years is you really want to get something to happen. Very often, you've got to pull individuals out of those teams, put them in a room, and say, okay, this is the thing we need to make happen. And then that honesty begins to kick in because it isn't, because, I remember doing very quickly, I remember doing something when I took over a legal business. And the first thing I wanted to do was to find out what all the customers thought. So the head of customer,
Mhm.
well, obviously that's my project. And I'm like, no, actually, I'm giving that to him. And she was like, oh my goodness, I'm terribly offended. But I'm like,
Right.
it's still your responsibility, but I want to put him in charge of it because I actually think it would do him a lot of good to go and talk to some customers. Because you know what I mean? And I think sometimes you've got to break these systems in order to get to the new thing.
I think it's really key what you said. I will add to it or pull the thread a bit to say important part about transportation, and you talk about this sort of idea around extreme accountability and extreme ownership. So
Hmm.
you don't need every person on every team to show up to every meeting. That's going to slow you down. But
Right.
you do need to be able to have the right people. And right could mean, a combination of people giving them new opportunities to flex and grow, or it could be because somebody has meaningful experience and depth and knowledge. So I do think you have to be able to have a cross-functional team, and you have to have the right ownership. But right ownership needs to be sort of a blended approach, no doubt.
And do you think that it's good to personify change and transformation? So what I mean by that is, I mean, some companies have like a chief, transformation officer, or they put somebody in charge of the transformation. Because I always feel like if that's done properly, that's a great message. We actually are going to transform, and we've put somebody in charge of it, because then that person is accountable for making that change happen, and so it's in their interest to actually make it happen. Um, I don't know. Do you think that works?
I think it does, but I think there's so many smaller scale things that where you need that same transformative mindset. You need to be able to take the same type of philosophies or principles, or call it framework. I love that word, and be able to apply it to smaller, but just as maybe meaningful change or transformation. And I think you use this word a lot in your book, but we should have empowerment to believe in ourselves, that you don't necessarily need a title or a special role to be empowered to lead through change. And I
Right.
think that that's something that people don't understand, or they're maybe not as comfortable with. But I think we should talk more about as leaders is to say, hey, don't wait for the opportunity, or don't wait for someone with a big title or some, formality in an organizational structure in order to be able to achieve change or able to achieve transformation. Because especially, in today's world where AI is just accelerating, right, the rate of transformation and the rate of change, we really need to empower people at all levels to
Hmm.
understand how can they be effective in their own role in delivering change and
Yeah.
transformation. So I'd say, yes, they're effective. And yes, I completely understand why organizations want to push, kind of bring someone in who's successfully led through large scale transformation. But I don't think you have to wait for that.
Yeah. And I also think I mean, obviously, we all know that communication is terribly important in
Yeah.
these things, and the boss and blah, blah, blah. But I really, really believe in the idea of the sort of cascade, and that companies really have to work on that, and make sure that, as you say, that each individual who's affected and involved gets the message that's relevant to them, right?
Mhm.
And if they go and talk to their boss and they say, we just heard that, we just had Crystal talking to us, and they say, oh yeah, that was good, wasn't it? What did you think? Well, same as you. That's not a great look, right? You
Right.
want you want your manager to actually kind of be equipped with information and stuff that's going to be helpful to you as an individual. And I think companies that get that and are really ready to invest in the systems and the time, I think that can really make a difference.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think, and probably I'd love to hear more about you. You probably can think of some really good examples and really real world scenarios where helping people to modify their communication patterns to be able to communicate more effectively has sort of been an unlock in maybe their career, or how they've motivated teams or been successful in leading with teams. But the thing about communication is that it has to be bidirectional, in that it's not just about our ability to package information and concepts and ideas in a meaningful way that translates with people, but it's also, finding people who are willing to be transparent and honest with you back as to whether or not that landed,
Yeah.
and being willing to ask, did that land? Because I think we sort of arrogantly go along our way saying, wow, that was a really powerful message. And we may or may not have landed, may or may not be left clear with the receiver. So I think that's the other
It's
piece of
not
it.
just about what we say; it's about what they hear.
That's right. All
And
right.
I
It goes
think
back to perception.
when I was doing internal communication for a company with people spread all over the world, that was something that we really, really worked on. Which was, it felt like the job was just to produce the communication, and we could give it ourselves a tick and say we did the job. But it really wasn't the job done until we felt that somebody had heard it and understood
Hmm.
it and knew why it was relevant to them, which is a lot harder.
It is. It is. And goes back to the vulnerability, can be painful to hear, especially when you think, oh, I really nailed it, that maybe otherwise it didn't land. And so, how do you back up and start again and try again? Be willing to do so, with a little humility. It's important, though. I mean,
So actually, that would, I'd love to, if we could just make a little segue into, if you don't mind, I'd love
yeah,
to talk a little bit more personally, if you like, about
sure.
you as a leader, and kind of, my concept of mepathy, this idea of understanding what you've just been saying, like being able to say, I'm not sure that that did land. And let's think about why it didn't, and why is it that I said all the words and yet somehow other people heard something different from what I wanted them to understand. That is very, very important and very interesting. And just kind of in terms of building up your self-awareness as a leader and what people see when you talk, when you walk into the room, when you run a meeting or an event. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think, the key word for me with empathy is understanding. You have to really, you have to understand how you're being perceived. In fact, one of the best interview questions I was ever given, and also one of the toughest, because it happened when I was really young, was if your former boss was sitting in this room, what do you think they'd say about you?
Uh-huh.
And it was incredibly difficult, and it sort of caught me off guard because I had, done all of the due diligence of writing down questions that I thought that they'd ask, and that was one that I could not have anticipated. But it was brilliant because it required me to be reflective, self-reflective, and sort of understand, how am I perceived, and articulate that. And so I would say we have to be able to understand what those perceptions are. It actually can be a little difficult to gather information because I think people are afraid sometimes to be
Hmm.
really honest about, how you're coming off in a group and
Hmm.
sort of how you're showing up.
Yeah.
I think we wait until the other sort of drag is that we wait until formal review periods, at least in professional organizations, to get that feedback. When we have a whole host of opportunities to get that perception from our friends and our family, and my children are very good at giving me feedback. But I would say in a professional environment, we wait. We wait until these formal times and we wait for 360s and sort of these other tools to sort of force
Yeah.
it. And I don't know that it's as organic as the feedback that we would get if we really were just in a conversation with somebody and we were with somebody that was willing to be completely honest. So I think, finding ways to uh, get that true feedback is important. The other caution, though, is I think it should inform and build, we should build into our leadership style how those perceptions may shape us. But I think when it comes to decision making, is the caution to me would be not to over rely on it. And the only reason why I say that is because I do think that as leaders, we have to develop judgment, key
Hmm.
judgment. And so I would never want to sacrifice. And I think over the years, I have built good judgment. I think most of the leaders in leadership roles are trusted for their judgment to make good decisions, taking into account all sorts of different insights, including right self-awareness about the concept or whatever we're leading into. So I just would caution that in decision making mode where judgment becomes something that I really need to rely on, I wouldn't want to overthink or over rely on the perception of how I'm going to lead through this and
Yeah.
cloud that judgment because that judgment is so important.
I mean, absolutely. And what you were saying before, of course, if you do want to seek feedback from people who work with you, whether they're peers, whether they're people working your team, you can't just go from one day to the next. You've got to build trust over time. You've got
Hmm.
to give them something, they'll give you something. They've got to learn that if they tell you the truth, you're not going to go off in a bad mood and hold it against them later. This is a delicate thing, right?
Right.
And we all know with our relationships with our other halves, the question, do I look good in this, is a tricky question, right?
It is.
Uh, I think that we have to recognize that, and I also think that we, as leaders, it's very important to understand that we're not good at everything and know what it is that we want to work on. So it's like there's going to be some feedback that someone might
Yes.
give me, which would be not very helpful. I mean, realistically, if someone says to me, "Well, I feel like you're not very detail orientated," well, that be Um, but
Right.
on the other hand, what is important is when there's a misperception, right? When you believe that everybody, if you say to your team, "Well, that went really well, didn't it?" and your
Right.
team says, "No, boss, that
Mm,
went
you
very well."
didn't land.
That's when you want to dig in and say, "Okay, why is there a difference between what I think and what they seem to be seeing?"
Yeah, that's so true. And I think where this has really been present or when I've really felt it was, and it happens a lot in transformation when you have to make restructure or realignment or and you've impacted maybe a set of folks or you've had to go through a reduction in force or, reorging that impacts people's jobs. the way you communicate about that,
Hmm.
you really I have often tried to spend a lot of time after delivering the messaging to make sure that people understand. And if they didn't and were willing to tell me that I would show up, either have a one-on-one with them to allow them to sort of give me and ask me anything, or show up to their team meeting to just be available to be as honest as I could, and to be as compassionate, as empathetic as I could, because I think oftentimes we're guided as leaders to be very formal and very
Yeah.
rigid when we're delivering news around organizational restructure. But the reality is, we should have a little more authenticity there, because
Hmm.
we're all human beings and we all have, the impact is great, and it's far reaching, during transformational periods like that where you have to go through a restructure. So I think those are the elevated sort of like inflection points in my life or my career, where I'd say having empathy and having self-awareness and being intentional about that has taught me a lot about how to handle those sensitive discussions with people.
Yeah. Super interesting. Well, you're not going to believe this, but we've hit 45 minutes.
Wow,
I
time
know, it's
flies.
incredible. We've been chattering away here, and I do like to try to keep to that sort of time because this is a lunch hour chat, and we've got to have time to eat the lunch. It won't be free, sadly. Um, but so just to let me think will be a good thing to finish with, a nice sort of interesting question. Um, you know, what do you think? When you It's so much talk at the moment about AI, and I'm sure that in your world, and it's not just AI, it's changing technology, right? And the changing way that we work. What do you think is going to change, and what do you think is just going to stay the same in terms of the kind of projects you're leading? And if you were to look forward, say 3 to 5 years, do you see things changing dramatically?
I do, especially in healthcare. I think you know, the idea of personalization has just deepened. People are demanding, particularly in healthcare, they want more of a consumer like approach to healthcare. They want to know what they're paying. They don't want any surprise bills. They want to, have access to medications without waiting 3 months to get in with a doctor. They want, you know, access, personalization. When I say personalization, know me. When I show up, don't treat me like I'm a
Yeah,
patient that you've never seen before and that you haven't been, reviewing my records. And so AI really expands our opportunity to personalize a healthcare experience for most people. And so I think AI is going to be very pivotal. I think we are under the gun a bit and maybe a little bit behind on understanding as leaders our role in the safe use of AI, and
right.
how to accelerate the utility of it without sacrificing the safety. And what I mean by that is, as you know, right, anytime we're advancing technology, particularly at this pace, there's some dangers with that, dangers in sharing information, or dangers in information getting out to other people. And we hear about all of that all the time. And I don't think compliance or security and things like that have necessarily caught up. So as leaders, we need to be thinking about that.
Yeah,
And how are we using those cautions to inform our, yes, need. And it is going to be wildly helpful as a consumer of healthcare ourselves to, I think, enhance our experience. But I think there is a little bit of, and over the next 3 to 5, especially in the next 18 months, probably, where we're going to have to start to put a little bit of guardrails around how we're going to make decisions using AI in a safe way.
yeah. That's super interesting. I personally, we've all had the experience, right? Go to the doctor and you're a bit disappointed. They don't seem to, hardly seem to remember you, even though that you remember them. They don't seem to remember much about your case, and they seem a little bit disinterested in general. So when we are in fact dealing with an interactive chatbot who knows everything about us and is incredibly friendly, knows all the names of our children, and asks us tons of suitable questions,
Hmm.
will we be happier because will we be taken on that ride of not caring it that it's actually not a human? It's still interested in us. I think that's a really interesting question.
It's so true. It can be a bit scary, I think. And again, it goes back to the rate of acceleration. And
Yeah,
because we've all been used to technology disrupting the way we experience the world. AI is on a different type of trajectory. And to me,
yeah,
I think that's going to be something that we'll have to have ongoing discussions around, because I think the pace at which the technology comes to market is going to be faster. There'll be a lag and sort of
Mhm.
like general consensus of how to safely use it, or general consensus around security. But there's no doubt the demand is so great for that, for this sort of what I'm calling consumer like experience in healthcare, that there's no way to accomplish or achieve that without AI, or at least machine learning, at a minimum.
And let's face it, it's one thing to get the rabbit out of the hat. It's another thing to get the rabbit back in if you've got second thoughts. And
Exactly.
it's going to be very interesting. Well, look,
And have you
Crystal.
ever used AI before where I don't know if anybody you've experienced where you've asked Chat GPT a question and they give you the wrong answer? And when
Well,
you challenge them
absolutely.
on that, chat, GPT will say, "Oh, sorry about that."
Funnily enough, I've had that exact experience quite recently when I asked it something and I knew what the correct answer was, and they gave me a completely different answer. Very convincing one,
Very
um,
convincing.
but it was kind of a little bit concerning because it was so convincing that I would have thought it was correct if it just happened to know in this case that that wasn't correct.
Right. And so what if we delivered a nurse who was trying to help you create your own personalized nutrition plan, and that was a bot, was an AI created, and gives the wrong information about healthcare? That is where, when I say responsibility and safety, that those are where my mind that's where my mind goes. And I think that we're going to, as leaders, be challenged with this crossroads of the ask and the use of AI technology is going to accelerate faster than our preparedness to be able to know what responsible means.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? We're continuing on here, but that that all of us through life have dealt with people that we know make things up, right? We
True.
just know that that person over there, they talk great, but they make things up, and yet we don't really think about the idea of AI making things up.
Right. Right. You
In
just
reality,
trust it. You just felt like, oh, this is a service. It must be, it must be real. Somebody else must have vetted it for me.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, we definitely need to draw this to a close. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I think we're going to have you back on because we've still got tons to talk about. But really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for giving up your lunch hour to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun. I could talk to you for hours.
Fantastic. Well, it's been an enormous pleasure. So thank you very much. This has been the Free Lunch with Eddie Ross and Crystal Elam.